condition they go into. So what's the equipment that God gives as a starter kit for Adam and Eve as they are in the garden? Verse 10, now a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 riverheads. The name of the first is Pishon, and it is the one which skirts the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and the onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one which goes around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Hiddekel. It is the one which goes toward the east of Assyria. The fourth river is the Euphrates. Now, this idea, the word for river there is Nahar. And the word Nahar can be used to refer to any large flow of water. So you can even have like a current in the ocean can be referred to with this. So it's just the flowing of water. Now on the land, the flowing of water is typically going to be a river, right? You're going to have the movement of a stream. You're going to have water that's moving across the surface. So a current in the ocean, a river on the land, it's a moving large flow of water. And so this Nahar went out of the garden to water the garden. So notice this. It goes out of the garden to water the garden. And what we find is this idea, okay, there's a origin somewhere in the garden, and it's flowing out. There's an origin of water in the garden, and it's flowing out. The only type of thing where you're going to have that is something like an artisanal well, where there's water that is being pushed up out of the ground, and then it's flowing up out. There hasn't been, I mean, God could have simply just had snow-capped mountains that's melting down or whatever else, but there's no reason to believe that. The earth was laid out in this way where it was far gentler. The mountains were far lower. The mountains get pushed up in the process of the flood. We find that there's this gentle sloping earth to begin with, and so what is this water source? It's this water that comes up. And the interesting thing, when you look at what happens in other parts of the Bible, for example, in the temple, there's water that comes out of the temple. When you read, for example, the work that's occurring, there's this, and so you find there's interesting work that's done in terms of the water that's available there, and the extra biblical sources have all sorts of interesting things about the way that the water was brought up onto Mount Zion. But this is a part of the idea of when you think about the garden is a temple, and as a temple, it's a pointer to the idea of the whole world being a temple that is filled with God's glory. The tabernacle is a type of that. The temple itself that was built on Mount Zion is a type of that. And what's ultimately going to happen is the whole earth is going to be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. And we find that the whole earth will be a temple, and there's going to be this idea that in the church there is the river of life that flows out. Okay, so the symbolism of this supply of water that's there is given to us in the heavenly Jerusalem, which is the garden city. It's put forward in more detail. So these rivers are more about the idea of the provision physically. They are about the provision physically for the garden, and they're also tools for dominion for being able to go and extend the garden. This is God's generous supply. We have a Nahar, a river, and this large amount of water that flows and it's going out of the garden, and then it waters the garden. And so we have, it breaks into 4 river heads. The 4 river sources, the 4 river heads in Eden flowing out. So the artisanal well idea is my understanding, my best explanation of how this would work. And what we have is these 4 rivers that leave Eden. They are a source of water for being able to do other things. And so that makes it so that you can extend the garden more easily. You can till the earth. You can grow crops. You can supply for your needs. You can supply water for animals, and you can deal with transport. So we have here this dominion setup. We have the river Pishon that goes to the east, and we're given a lot of description about it. It skirts the whole land of Havilah. Now, the word land of Havilah is either in Arabia or it's the Hindu Kush. Now, it flows to the east, so it's not going to Arabia. This is going to India. So this goes that direction. Now, real quickly, remember this. This whole terrain is dramatically altered by the flood. These rivers have names that are associated with rivers that exist after the flood. My understanding of how that occurs is you have Noah and his sons that spent a great deal of time in the pre-flood world, and they take the names of the old world and give them to things they find in this new world after the flood. Now, men never do that, right? Like when Europeans came to America, they didn't just name everything after some European town and slap new in front of it. That is the easiest thing for men, is to take these names and to just reapply them. And so when we find that there's these names applied, we need to remember there's a dramatic alteration of the space. The Hindu Kush itself is a creation of the flood. I mean, there were these huge mountains that are created there, and this whole sort of plateau of heightened land with the mountains on them is a result of this change of the space from the flood. But this idea that Havilah being the zone, there's a space equivalent where we think of Havilah after the flood, this place where the Hindu Kush is about the zone geographically in space on the face of the earth where you would have found this land. So the name of the first is Paishan. It's the one which skirts the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and the onyx stone are there. Now, if you ever played any video game that's kind of taking kids along, it'll be like, hey, here's a mission, and here's some stuff that you might be able to get as a reward. Why do you do that? Because otherwise you're kind of like, I don't know what to do. So what God does here is he gives this river, it's like, hey, look, there's kind of a highway of water flowing out. Wonder what's at the end of that river. And then God says, it goes to this land, of Havilah. Okay, great. And then we've got, anything cool there? There's gold. There's a lot of gold. It's really good gold. Also, bdellium and onyx are there. What are those for? I don't know. Maybe you should get them and experiment. Right? This idea that there's this stuff there that's exciting to go get, this sort of a quest, a mission, a part of the subduing of the earth is finding things, experimenting with it, figuring out how they're supposed to be used, making things, building things, beautifying things. What can these things be used for that's productive, and what can they be used for that beautifies? And so we find that God has laid out this system of rivers that are transport systems out, and they lead back to a hub, the Garden of Eden. Now, there's gold in Havilah. The gold's really good gold. What's gold useful for? Well, we're going to find out in time. It's useful for currency. It's useful for jewelry. It's good for ornamentation. And far down the line, you find industrial uses, right? There's lots of industrial uses for gold now. And so all these other things, like, people are discovering more and more that this work of dominion to take stuff and try to make stuff and to do things with it, that work is dominion work to subdue the earth, to make the earth beautiful and fruitful. And God gives all these resources, and he gives mechanisms for interaction between men. One of the other things that's beautiful here, the Bible is going to explain later in Genesis that currency is, we have gold and silver being the currency of the merchants. So people doing dominion work, private persons, figure out how to go and do useful stuff. You don't have to wait for the government to tell you to go do something. You don't have to wait for a government grant to go do something. You can just do dominion work. You can just do things. And when you go and do things, you get to enjoy the fruits of that labor. You get to figure out how to use stuff that God has made and to make it useful to other people. Currency is about the ability to make trade easier by having a store of wealth, something that's transportable, something that's divisible, something that's identical in terms of one piece to the other, so you don't have to worry about judging the quality so much. This idea that you're able to make it so that here's a thing that everybody wants and can use to convert into other stuff they want, and so it's an easy thing to trade with, as opposed to figuring out how many goats do I need to get for my ox. You instead say, Here's a value that people are buying and selling oxen at. Here's a value that people are buying and selling goats at. And as opposed to having to bring all the animals to trade, I can bring you the gold, buy the ox or sell the ox, and we can then go from there, and I can go get whatever I want. Currency, gold, is something that God made, and it seems, according to the rest of the Bible, that it was made for the purpose of currency. It's something that God communicates about as currency over and over and over again. So this idea of something that's useful for trade there at the end of that river. Now, there's bdellium there. These things, the bdellium and the onyx, these would have been things that the Jews in the Old Covenant would have known what these things were because there are commands related to the temple about it. For us, these terms are difficult to assign very specifically to actual materials in the world because that's been lost, and we're not intended to communicate a continuation of the practice of the temple. We don't know all the materials that get used there, exactly what things the labels refer to, and that's a part of what God intentionally lost from the knowledge of men so that they would not return to it. The fact that we are not certain what all the materials are for every part of what happens with the temple is a part of God's guarding us from Judaizing because men love the outward pomp and glory. And he says, nope, I'm not going to let you keep that information. You're not going to be able to go back to it with certainty. You're going to have that safeguard. So what this onyx and bdellium are is partly a question of what does these terms mean in terms of material. And when we think about what bdellium normally is, most times scholars think that bdellium is a gum or a valuable jewel. You know, pretty much the same thing, right? I mean, no significant difference there. You could chew on one and the other one not so much. So the idea that gum is a material, like a goo, like something from a tree, a sap, something that you can use to join things together, potentially create smooth surfaces, all that kind of stuff. And then a valuable jewel, some sort of rock that you put in things. Onyx stone, a black stone, a white stone, these things going together, is normally the understanding of what this is. But again, scholars disagree. And so we have this idea, though, that there are three things valuable here: gold, bdellium, and onyx. And so they're at the end of the river, and that creates a space to go. And if you get to the end of that river and you want to come back, guess what? You either got to walk and carry this stuff, or you got to figure out how to navigate rivers, how to make ships or boats move along the river, and to go against the current. These are little mysteries, little tasks, little difficulties, little experimentation jobs that would be laid out there as obvious early problems to solve to where we would think about modern Ethiopia. Okay, so it goes south. We then have the Hiddekel. That's a name that was used in Hebrew for the Tigris. And it goes to the west. It goes toward the east side of Assyria. Assyria was to the west of the Garden of Eden's location at this time. And we had this idea that it goes west into Assyria. And then we have the Euphrates, and its direction would therefore be to the north, as we have these four different directions of the rivers. Now, these directions going out, this kind of cross-shaped going out of waters, would provide a cardinal direction set of highways out that makes it so that you can then have sort of space between. The further out they would go, the farther apart they would be. So as the race of man increases in number, there'd be more space between them. You could have irrigation go between. You could have roads. You could make canals. I mean, one of the interesting things that Joseph seems to have done, this isn't in the Bible, but it is something that has a name in history. Joseph, there's a canal that goes from a reservoir to the Nile that has the name of the canal of Joseph that's in Egypt. And the tradition is that he organized the labor to build that as a part of his time during the 7 prosperous years. And so this building of canals and the connecting of water spaces is something that you find men have done for ages, where they have taken the water sources that do exist, created irrigation and canals to make it so the movement of water and stuff can occur, and to connect those, to connect the places of water to each other, because water allows for the easiest transport of stuff. Even now, we have planes, trains, and automobiles. And those things together none of them can move goods as cheaply as ships can still. The cheapest way to move a pound of good a mile is on a ship. And that would have been true in the past. It was overwhelmingly true in the past. And even now, as men have increased their capacity to move goods on the land, and even through the air, we find the cheapest way to move stuff is on the water. So this idea of having dominion capabilities that come with the water is something we see the provision of God. So these rivers are useful natural resources before and after the fall. But before the flood, these things would have existed. And even before the authorization to eat meat, they would have been also especially valuable. Because here's one of the things. If you have to move animals and have them do work, but you can't eat them, you become even more dependent upon the growing of food. And the animals, as a resource, are lessened, and the cost of taking care of them is something where you go, okay, I have to deal with water especially. So if we have beasts of burden to carry goods, and we have to deal with animals that are being taken care of, these rivers would have been very valuable for agriculture, very valuable transport, very valuable for the care of animals and humans. So rivers are highways of trade, highways of transport, highways of communication, and they provide long spaces of visibility. So these things, they provide borders. Now after the fall, you have to deal with protection, and rivers become useful as guards of a flank or a side or a back. And so you have all of these uses after the fall. But even before the fall, trade, transportation, communication, and of visibility. Rivers are sources of drinking water for men and beasts. They're sources of irrigation, and they allow for trash and waste removal with ease. These are the things that men have used rivers for historically. And they're also sources of pleasantness and fun and beauty. People love to be near water. They love to be near the sound of moving water. This is a gift that God gave these rivers. So all of this setup is the starter kit that's given to Adam. In verse 15, then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. In other words, the literal Hebrew there is more like, in the day you eat of it, dying you shall die. You can even make it more literal, and it's more like, in the day you eat thereof, you shall die. That's not a typo. God intentionally does that. He stacks it up. It's a big deal. There's both a process and a punctiliar nature to it, and there's an emphasis to the greatness of it. Matthew Poole talks about this death, and he says it's threefold. Spiritual, by the guilt and power of sin. At the instant you eat, you shall be dead in trespasses and sins. And he cites Ephesians 2. It's temporal, or the death of the body, which shall then begin in you by decay, infirmity, terrors, dangers, and other harbingers of death. And 3, it's eternal, which shall immediately succeed the physical death. So there's this spiritual death, there's physical death and dying, and there's the locking in of an everlasting death that occurs when you have the physical death. Now, the idea that these are punctiliar, they happen, there's a spiritual death right there, and there's a beginning of this physical death right there. And then there's also process. There's the decay of the body. And Romans teaches us about the process of spiritual death. People have suppression of the truth. They don't glorify God. And then they keep suppressing the truth, and they become grosser and grosser in their sin. And so the longer you live in this suppression of the truth time, the more you're going to make worse the corruption of your mind. The deadness of your mind will increase. And this was a time, when we look at the time after the fall, we're looking at men living for centuries not believing. And so their sins would magnify and magnify and magnify. Have you ever met an old wicked man or an old wicked woman? They are hardened in their sin and grotesque in the extent of the perversion in a way that's different from the young fool who is chasing after pleasure early in his perversions. There is this deepening of the darkness that occurs. That's what's being talked about in the dying you shall die. There's a death that occurs, and there's this progression of spiritual death, and your body becomes more and more a tool of sin. And then there's the great death. And so these things, this is the life of the fallen man without conversion, and that's being pointed out here in this dying you shall die. Now, there's an assignment of work, right? The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. This work of tending is the work of cultivating, the adding to gains attained. So children, those of you that have played Minecraft, right? You're used to, you get a bunch of tools and you go and build new stuff. That's a game version of being able to engage with the real world and extend man's dominion. Again, what are games? What is play? They are training to work. Play, when fathers play with their children, they are training their children how to work. You enter their childish world and help them to see things more like they really are, and their play gives them categories to think about work more. Now, this work of tending, of cultivating, is getting new gains. And there's a physical duty, and that was what we think about when we think about this idea of tending the garden, of cultivating the earth. We think about the going along of these rivers, spreading out the garden to fill the earth, having more children to fill the space and to work the ground. But there's also a duty to cultivate the mind. There's a duty to not only get gains in terms of the physical world, there's a duty to get gains in terms of the growth of the knowledge of God. And this cultivation work, this positive work, involves you learning new truths and you spreading the knowledge of the truth to other people. So sometimes people like to say the Great Commission is sort of embedded in the dominion mandate. That's true in the sense that there is a command to fill the earth with the knowledge of God. There is a difference, though. The Great Commission is a covenant of grace commissioning that deals with all the problems of the fall. It has all the tools necessary to deal with a fallen world. The dominion mandate was a grant that did not exist in the context of the fall. So baptism is a sign that's given in the Great Commission, right? Baptize, disciple the nations and baptize them. This idea of give them the symbol of the washing for cleansing and disciple them in all of the doctrine of Christ. Give all the commands of Christ. There are tools that are given to us that were not given before the fall. And there are tools that are given to us that weren't given immediately after the fall. We have the full kit. So you think about all this kit, this starter kit that God gave to Adam before the fall, and it was glorious and sufficient for the duties he had. And we now, in the New Covenant Church, we have everything necessary for our work of discipling the nations. Our situation is so much more powerful and glorious than the situation that Adam has. And my hope has been that as we walk over this stuff that God gave to Adam, that you see, this was glorious, this was beautiful, this was amazing, this was neat stuff. This was stuff that men's hearts would sing to have. How many of you crave for some sort of riverfront property? And what we have received is greater than what Adam received. And whereas Adam's commissioning was something that was predestined to fail, our commissioning is predestined to be victorious. That under the second Adam, we will see the nations discipled. Under the first Adam, this work of dominion was not complete, and there was a failure, and death entered the world. Under the second Adam, we are raised from the dead, and given power, not only to tend and keep, but to conquer. And the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. That word keeping is a haunting foreshadow of Adam's failure to guard when the serpent came in. His duty was to tend it, to cultivate it, to build, to gain. And his duty to keep was a duty to maintain, to preserve, to guard. There are things that we work hard to build, and other men and demons work hard to steal them. The more you make, the more you build, the more beautiful and productive it is, the more the Marxists, the demons, and the reprobate men, but I repeat myself, seek to come in and steal the means of production and the things that are beautiful. The more success we have, the more danger we have. The more you see a big church, a beautiful church, with beautiful life in it, with women worthy of marriage and men worthy to marry them. The more you find that, the more you find something that's attractive for men who are wolves to come and steal. The more demons give attention to wanting to destroy there and hate the concentration of angel armies that gather around that place. The duty to keep is something that exists from the small days of small beginnings, and it carries on to the great days of much being piled up. At the very beginning here, Adam was given a bunch of raw materials, given the starter kit, given a wife, and Satan comes in and seeks to destroy, and at the very first test, he doesn't keep. He doesn't guard. He doesn't maintain. Man's sin is so often to abdicate and to not guard. We are prone to work hard to build new things and then to be lax. But the maintaining of discipline, the maintaining of guard, the building of walls, the placing of night watchmen, the placing of guards to watch on the wall and to give warning is a part of the duty of keeping. There's the maintaining work and there's the guarding. And that's what it is to keep. There's authority given in this text, page 6, to eat of all the trees with one exception. The threat of the covenant is given. The day you eat of that tree, dying you will die. And again, this is physical death and spiritual death. Physical death is an act of suicide. Eating of this tree is like drinking a bottle of poison. Eating from this tree was like putting a gun to the head. This was an act of suicide when they ate of this tree. There was an immediate loss of the immortality of the body at the eating. A corruption that begins, the principle of death entering in and the process of dying, starting, aging, sickness, eventual death. And the follow-on involves a giving of this to their posterity and personal separation of body and soul. In other words, this is the succession of the covenant. From the first time that God entered a covenant with man, it always had succession. It always goes to the children. The covenant always goes to the children. And that covenant here, Adam represented himself and his successors, his heirs, his children. Every man born would receive this deadness of body and deadness of soul. Every man born by ordinary generation. And that's why it's so important to understand the idea that Christ received an extraordinary, a special generation. The work of the Holy Spirit to cause him to be conceived in the womb of the Virgin Mary and born of her, yet without sin. It's special to separate him from the succession of these curses. The spiritual death, what happened right at the time of the fall, is a suppressing of the truth. And before that fall, there was a failure to seek sufficiently and to not deal with, fighting properly what the serpent says when he comes. At the fall, there's an increase of the suppressing. There's as opposed to a righteousness of mind where there was still a failure to seek sufficiently, there is now this suppression that's active. There's an external suppression from Satan coming in with the heresy, and then there's this self-deception. And then we have this following on of the suppression of truth. It goes across time and spreads across generations, passes on to posterity. There's a magnified sense of distraction, temptation, internal resistance to the truth, the self-contradiction and the refusal to fix that and to have integrity. So Intergangeting like to call that narding. And I've tried to put in bold certain key things to be thought about and meditated on. And when I come back and teach on those, I'll be emphasizing those definitions. So my hope is that you'll be able to have these doctrines clearly in mind, that as you read this text, you understand what's being foreshadowed, what's being hinted at, and we see these things explained in other parts of Scripture plainly and clearly. But I stand open now to comments, questions, and objections from those with speaking rights. Mr. Nye?
Thank you very much for your teaching, Pastor. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. The first was on when you were talking about Leviticus 17 and 18, about those being the ceremonial laws that everyone is bound to keep even after the abrogation of the other ceremonial laws. So in Leviticus 18, there are moral laws mixed in with those. And those would be laws that are morally meant to keep. Like they're not all ceremonial laws. I'm just wanting to confirm that.
So in Leviticus 18, a lot of the commentators say the ceremonial passages end after verse 17. So at verse 18, nor shall you take a woman as a rival to her sister to uncover her nakedness while the other is alive. They'll interpret that not to be referring to a biological sister or a household sister, but as in a woman at all. In other words, a prohibition on polygamy, for example. And so they'll oftentimes read verse 18 as the beginning of a moral law section. But that makes it so that you have to deal with verse 19, for example, which deals with customary impurity. You end up making that a moral law as opposed to a ceremonial one.
Yeah.
And so I don't have a large concern about which way they read it, because regardless, that continues to be obligatory regardless. And so I read the whole section as being a set of things that are repeated in that ceremonial law. Pastor Shortley.
I think what you have is the strangled animals and the blood possibly is ceremonial. The part about fornication obviously is not, and the laws relating to consanguinity are these are positive. They're homosexuality, adultery, fornication, premarital sex. These are natural moral laws, which means they're based on God's nature and character and are intrinsically immoral, no matter what. And then there's things called positive moral laws, which are based solely on God's authority. That covers all forms of incest, because obviously Adam and Eve's children had to intermarry. Those are positive moral laws. The not eating things sacrificed to idols is a positive moral law. It's not a ceremonial law. And it's done for two reasons. You're eating something that's a sacrament to Satan, but I think the main reason here is trying not to offend the Jews. And then, of course, fornication is obviously both a natural moral law and a positive moral law, and it's not ceremonial. The reason given for not eating the blood in the Old Testament is life is in the blood, and then, of course, it's used for sacrifice. So I can understand people saying that's ceremonial. However, that may be a positive moral law. But I think these laws are there really because they needed to be emphasized, because incest was widespread in the pagan world. And I think part of it is to not offend the Jewish brethren. And Paul goes about that in Corinthians when he talks about, hey, I know that these idols don't exist, and if I'm hungry and I need to get some meat that had been offered to idols, I'll go ahead and eat it. But I won't do it to offend the weaker brethren. So there's that element. But I think the way to look at it is there's positive moral laws based on God's, purely based on God's authority. And that's the same thing with not eating the tree in the garden. That's a positive moral law. There's nothing intrinsically bad about this tree, but God said so. And then you've got natural moral laws, which are always wrong no matter what, because they're based on God's nature and character. Now keep in mind, positive moral laws in the Old Testament applied to both Jews and Gentiles. So the menstruation thing, it's probably a positive moral law that still applies, and it applied in the Old Testament. Ceremonial laws obviously did not apply to the Gentiles who were sojourners in the land of Israel. But positive moral laws did, and obviously natural moral laws did. I hope that helps.
So, and that idea of a positive moral law as opposed to a ceremonial law, the difference would be a ceremonial law, by definition, it points to Christ, or it foreshadows something in the new covenant, or it's a moral symbol. It's a symbol for some moral duty. And so in the sense of these things having symbolic value would be the question of whether they're ceremonies or merely positive moral laws. Would you agree, Pastor Schwartley, that would be the difference between a moral positive law and a ceremonial law?
The ceremony, like you said, you're totally correct about that. The ceremonial laws either are pointing directly to Christ or worship, or they're pointing to the necessity of separation. Don't mix your barley and wheat together. Don't mix this with that. Don't mix the cloths together. That's teaching sanctification through types and ceremony, through typology. So I think those things are fairly easy to tell. But positive moral laws are, keep in mind, incest was wicked in the Old Testament, even before the giving of the law. And after the giving of the law of Moses, incest was wicked and wrong for the Gentiles. Because if you look at that list and how that section in Leviticus ends, God says, and because of these things, I'm casting out and killing the 7 Canaanite nations who did these things, which included all those things you mentioned, including the menstruation thing, including the incest. But it merits further study. Let's just say that.
Sure. I think this could be something that can be talked about further in the fellowship meal tonight. And so my concern, just to give you the basic reason why I use the term of ceremonial law on it, is because I think there is a moral duty symbolism element. I think there's also a fact that it is positive, and then I think that we have to have room for the lawfulness of the children of Adam and Eve being able to marry their siblings, and so there was an imposition at a certain time. That's my principal concern there, is to have a coherence along that, and also with Abraham, for example, marrying a half-sister. And so those are things that I've historically used, the idea that there's a point at which it's imposed, and then, so that could be picked up. Thank you, Pastor Schwartley. Appreciate your talking about that. I think it would be a great thing to talk further about in the fellowship meal this evening. All right. Was there anything else? Any other comments, questions, objections? Great. One last thing about that. What we just talked about, that we were wrestling through there, is not something that's a part of the covenanted uniformity about how to interpret the exact passage. It does have to be agreed that the application of those things, whether they're continuing ceremonial positive laws or whether they are moral positive laws, you must agree that those continue as an obligation. The confession explicitly teaches the continuing of the incest laws out of Moses, and so you have to believe that those are binding on you from God. But the exact way you're interpreting those verses regarding moral positive versus ceremonial is not a part of the covenanted uniformity. So hopefully that helps you to see the usefulness of being able to continue to wrangle through things as you're dealing with the points that you do agree on. Now, let's begin. Let's pray, and then we'll sing. Father, we thank you for your word. We ask that you would forgive us our sins and that you would bless us, that you would teach us. We thank you for our forefather Adam and the fact that you give us.
David when he fled from Absalom. David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Lord, those who trouble me are increasing, and there are many that rise against me. There are so many that say of my soul, surely there is no help for him in God. Selah. But you, O Lord, are a shield unto me. You are my glory, and you lift my head. So I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. Selah. I laid me down, and so there I did sleep. Then I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. Truly I will not fear 10,000 men, though they set up against me all around. Rise, Lord, save me, God, for you strike my foes on the cheekbone, breaking the wicked's teeth. Surely salvation belongs to the Lord, and your blessing is upon your people. Selah.
Lord, those who trouble me are increasing, and there are many that rise against me. There are so many that say of my soul, surely there is no help for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield unto me. You are my glory, and you lift my head. So I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. I laid me down, and so there I did sleep. Then I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. Truly I will not fear 10,000 men. Lo, they set up against me all around. Rise, Lord, save me, God, for you strike my foes on the cheekbone, breaking the wicked's teeth. Surely salvation belongs to the Lord, and your blessing is upon your people.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance